For that June thing?
No, actually,
It's been pretty stable?
it's been pretty stable. I think we only had a handful of students who, when, because you had a wait list, and then we only had a handful of students who weren't able to make it.
Hey, Carol.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. I'm Carol Finney. I'm the director of the MPID program here, and I've been asked to introduce a man who needs no introduction, so that makes it easy. As most of you know, Ron Heifetz was trained as a psychiatrist and a musician. He came to the Kennedy School in the 80s when I was a student here, and he came in as a student and basically never left. So many of you have had him in class or otherwise know about his work in the field of leadership. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ron Heifetz.
Is this working okay? Yeah, I can see it is. Yeah. Well, real pleasure. Congratulations, everybody, in graduating. I get to be one of the first. I hope most of you are done with your coursework. And somebody turned in a final paper just yesterday, so they was right in at the line. But I hope all of you are beginning to cool out and celebrate the fruits of your labor over this last year. And I hope all of you are going to have a fabulous time next week when, friends or family come in and celebrate your wonderful accomplishment and just celebrating you. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about some of the ways to be a little bit more strategic and thoughtful in your reentry over the next months, because as exciting as it will be, many of you, to return home, to return to your own countries, your own previous organizations, or how exciting it may be for many of you in transition to be moving to a new city, getting a new job, starting a new path, there are dangers that await you. And it's worth being aware of these dangers so that you navigate those waters with the least amount of damage and the best amount of gain for yourself. So why is it dangerous at all? Why are there any dangers? Well, I think you could probably guess many of the reasons why there are dangers. You've learned a lot of things this year, and the things that you've learned will probably incline many of you to go home and raise questions. And those questions themselves will sometimes be challenging to people, because you'll see blind spots or gaps or opportunities or problems in the culture of the environment you're going into that you'll want to begin to speak to. Some of those might be problems of a policy nature or of a human relations nature or of a social justice nature. But raising those kind of questions is really, in a way, an act of leadership and requires thoughtfulness. Because if you go home, if you go back, if you re-enter with banners flying and trumpets blaring, big ta-da, I am here, let me tell you what I've learned, and you go in wearing your Harvard cap or your Harvard shirt or your Harvard t-shirt or whatever's stamped on somewhere that you can publicize, you're really setting yourself up for danger. You might as well paint a bullseye on your chest or forehead and say, shoot me here. Because as much as people are going to be curious about what you've learned, they're also going to be potentially challenged or threatened by what you've learned. First of all, you've had the benefit, you've had the privilege of now entering the privileged caste. And those of you who come from unprivileged backgrounds or who primarily identify yourself as a person who's not privileged are now contaminated. You can't say you're not privileged having now been to Harvard. You are a problem. And you are not only part of the solution, you are part of the problem. So when you go home, people will see you with mixed eyes. On the one hand, you'll be the same old person they've always known and trusted or loved. But on the other hand, they don't know what's happened to you. And the moment you start talking weird ways, strange ways, they're going to say, some people will at least say, aha, you've been contaminated. You've been hanging around with those folks, and no longer are you one of us. And at that point, they will give you a loyalty test. They'll give you a series of loyalty tests. You know, they'll ask you questions. They'll check you out in various ways to determine will you revert back to your previous way of thinking and your previous location, or will you persist in having been in some ways changed? And the change that you embody, the change that you're going to represent, simply because you've learned things that make you see the world perhaps with a little more complexity, are going to be challenging to people. So when you re-enter, it's very important to have a lot of respect for the people who you're going home to. Or for those of you going into a new environment, it's really important to have respect for that local environment. You will, of course, carry with you all of the knowledge, all of the preconceptions, and indeed all of the prejudices that you might have going into that environment. But it's important to try to lay those aside and to listen and learn about the environment you're going back into. And I include the people who are going back to a familiar environment because you're in danger because you think you already know your people. But if you've learned anything this year, you've learned how to raise new questions and how to think in new ways about your own people. So it's important to go back and have a reverence for the kinds of changes that you might be seeking in that place where you plan to go. And to have a real appreciation, in fact, have a strategy of developing a deeper appreciation for where people are. Because when you start to disturb people and set things awry and generate what we might call disequilibrium, it's really important to anticipate the nature of that disequilibrium that you're going to generate. It's very important to locate whose toes are you going to step on and how many toes are you stepping on at one time. To be able to name those toes, to be able to name what are the costs that you're asking people to sustain if they're going to have to take into account your good or new or impassioned ideas. Because one of the basic principles in leadership is a social work principle, which is you always have to start with where people are. So when you go home, you think you know where you are, but you don't. And it's a big mistake to think you know where you are when you don't. Some of you might have been away for 5 or 10 years working in some international organization, and now you're going to go home. And you think you know the place where you're from. You don't. First of all, everybody's been through a lot of life in the last year. Some people have died. Economies have been in enormous disruption. Families have changed. Issues have emerged that are now ripe that weren't ripe before. And so it's very important to go back for nearly all of you. Not all of you, but for nearly all of you. It's very important, I think, to re-enter quietly. Don't go back, making a lot of noise, saying, let me tell you the truth now. Because I've been to Veritas, and that's our motto, truth. And now I've got it. Let me show you my diploma. And maybe you'll be wearing a hat, a t-shirt, and a necklace all at the same time saying Harvard. In order to announce how much truth you have now to dispense. Please try to withstand that temptation. It's a really strong temptation. I mean, you worked hard to get here, and now you worked hard to finish here. And you want to be recognized. And you want people to appreciate what you've done. And you want people to be interested in what you've learned. But your job, from the moment you get off the plane, is to be interested in them. And not to demand that they be interested in you. Of course, they'll be, if it's family and close friends, even colleagues, they'll be interested to some extent in you. But your job is to find out where they are. Because that'll help you then decide how much to say, when to say it, with whom to say it, how to frame some of the lessons that you've got, how to frame some of the questions that you want to raise. Otherwise, you're kind of blindly, shooting into an environment and creating unpredictable disruption. So those are the first lessons. Leadership is dangerous because we're frequently asking people to change in ways that generate losses. People don't resist change per se. As some of you heard me say, nobody gives back a winning lottery ticket. People love change when they're sure it's a good thing. People resist change when it involves the possibility or the actuality of a loss. And that's when people hunker down and start resisting. So an important part of your job is to begin to identify what's the nature of the challenge that I want to render to people. What are the losses I'm asking people to sustain? Am I asking people to sustain potential material losses in wealth, in power, in status? Am I asking people to sustain potential losses in competency? We're really good at this, and now you're asking me to be good at that. That's a hard loss for people. We're all pretty proud of our competency. That loss you've all experienced this last year because nearly all of you came to Harvard as very proud people, proud of all your competence. And then you were thrown in classrooms that told you were incompetent. Now, some classrooms that you walked into, you had no pride around being competent in that subject area. Like perhaps you had never taken a statistics class, so now you're taking a statistics class. You didn't feel ashamed or embarrassed of being incompetent. That was just the name of the terrain you had to traverse in pushing that frontier of competence and learning new material. But some of the courses you took were courses in which you felt you had a lot of competence. That was certainly true in those of you who took any of the leadership courses, because many of you wrote essays about what a great leader you are already. And now you wandered into one of these classes, and we sort of turned you upside down and said, do you really know how you're thinking about things? And many of you resisted, some of you like the plague, some of those challenges to your ways of thinking, where we were pushing you to develop new competence. For example, some of you are really skilled at analytical reasoning, but we pushed you to think relationally in terms of people. Some of you were really good at thinking about people, but you're not very good at thinking analytically. And so when it came to learning how to think strategically and analyzing a problem, that was hard for you. That threw you across your frontier of competence into a new zone of incompetence. And you had a lot of feelings about that. Many of you did. And that generated then various forms of resistance to having to dwell in that zone of incompetence long enough to finally learn some new things. So many of the ways in which you hope to challenge people this next year or in the next 5 years will be challenging people to develop new competencies. And I hope from your own experience here, you can have a little more compassion for what those losses mean. Because generally, you're asking people to sustain a challenge to their own sense of pride or sense of esteem, self-esteem, when you're asking them to go beyond their current level of know-how and competence. And the third form of loss, we have these direct material losses, losses of competence. The third form of loss you ought to listen for when you go home are losses of loyalty. People are deeply loyal to the people with whom they identify, in their families, in their culture, in their ethnicity, in their gender, in their sexual orientation, in their religious background. But some of the challenges you're going to be issuing to people are challenges to some of those identities, because you're asking people to redefine some of those identities. Not toss them completely overboard, but even a 5 or 10% change in some of those core lines of code associated with that identity are lines of code that people hold on to dearly, because they got those lines of code from people with whom they identify and perhaps have identified even since their childhood. So it's important to understand the kinds of disloyalty that you're asking people to sustain and the challenge to people in renegotiating or refashioning some of their loyalties to their own identities or their own identity groups if you're asking them to begin to change some of their cultural assumptions. And many of you care a lot about changing some of those cultural assumptions, particularly cultural assumptions that limit a culture in its ability to take advantage of the diversity in that culture, and that also limit the freedoms and rights and privileges of people who are not part of the dominant group. Some of you care a lot. You're going to throw your whole life at those problems. But I'd like to see you, as you re-enter, go into that pursuit, not setting yourself for early martyrdom, but setting yourself for a lifelong of sustained effort that's thoughtful, strategic, and even compassionate. Compassion is important because you have to know a lot about the people you're challenging. Even in war, the most fundamental principle is to know your enemy. You can't set a strategy without knowing your enemy. And very few things are more important in military operations than in the intelligence with which people try to understand the nature of the enemy, how it thinks, how it strategizes, what its aims and goals are, the internal politics within the regime prosecuting the war. All of those become incredibly important. And you can't understand that if you two-dimensionalize the enemy. You have to really be able to put your heart across the boundary to understand that enemy well. And that takes a deep amount of curiosity and even a real measure of compassion so that you can project yourself into their world and try to understand from their point of view, why are they doing this? Many of you have been engaging in that exercise in the last 2 months as the war in Ukraine, of course, has preoccupied the attention of many of us. So I want you to go back quietly. And I want you to go back listening. Indeed, for those of you going home to your home countries, I'd like you to go back and imagine yourself on a 3-month to 12-month research effort where you're doing field work to know your people in ways that you have never gotten to know your people. Many of us think we know our people, but nearly all of us come from countries and cultures that have rich variations and complexity. And we actually don't know our people very well. And if you're going to start to engage in changing things back home, it would be invaluable if you could first spend 3 to 12 months doing field work, just getting to know your people. Not getting to know your people in the way a political campaigner does. When political campaigners try to get to know their people, they're always selling something. They're not actually interested in people. They're interested in selling to people. Selling a politician, selling a point of view. What I'm suggesting is that you go home with no agenda except to get to know people. Lots of coffees, teas, lunches, dinners, walks, washing clothes, just getting to know people where they live. And from that research, from that open-hearted, open-minded research, apply what you've learned here this year. Apply what you've learned to ask better questions, to gather information more effectively, to ask the right follow-up question, and then the follow-up question past that. And many of you have practiced, those lines of questioning in the casework you've done here, either the formal cases presented in your case courses, or each other's cases that you've worked on, either in courses or informally, as you've gotten to know each other. So apply what you've learned this year, not to tell people what to do, but to learn about where people are. And spend a year, as long as a year, doing that. I mean, if you can afford it. Or if you can't afford doing it full time, do it on the weekends. But get to know your people before you start mucking around and trying to change things. From that information, as you begin to lose sleep and process it and come to terms with it, then you can begin to develop strategies for change, ways in which you might apply what you've learned here over this year to those particular contexts. Now, there are a few of you, just a few, who ought to go back with banners flying, where you want to leverage the authority that Harvard gives you in order to translate it quickly into a position of power and authority. And you're willing to take the heat, and you're willing to take people shooting at you because you're pretty sure that you're going to make it over that hurdle and gain that position. And from that position, you'll then have to fortify yourself or engage in the listening process to diffuse some of the hostility you will have generated for leveraging your Harvard credential in gaining a higher position of authority in competition with people who are there but don't have that added credential. There are only a few of you in that position. I don't know who that is. Once in a while, I meet somebody for whom that would be my advice. But the vast majority of graduates that I've worked with over these, as Carol said, now nearly 40 years, are people who really ought to enter quietly. Now, once again, I want to acknowledge how hard it is to do this. You're going to get off the plane and you're just going to be dying to tell people in one way or another how great you are and how much you know. And I'll tell you you're great, and I'll tell you how much you know, but you know, that's with a, you know, that and a few dollars you can buy a latte. Re-earning the trust of people back home will take some time. And if you could return the question, tell us what you've learned, with, I'm really eager to tell you what I've learned, but actually the most important thing I've learned is how to listen better. And I'd really like to know what's happened to you this year. What's happened in this organization? What happened to Jack, who was the boss? What happened to, Lisetta? What happened to, so that if you say, well, what I've learned is to be more curious. What I've learned is to, is to be a little more open-hearted. So I'd really like to know. Tell me. You'll be amazed at how eager people will be to tell you. And now then you can begin to use what you've learned here to listen with more sophistication than you have before. Now I remember, several years ago, maybe 10 years ago, giving this advice to one student from a Central Asian country. And he had spent 10 years working, I don't recall if it was at the World Bank, one of the big international organizations. And he was a brilliant analytical person. And now he was planning to go home for the first time in 10 years. And I said to him, he called me and he said, my prime minister has scheduled a call for next week, before graduation. He wants to talk to me. I said, okay, great, but let's go into that call and don't make any recommendations. Don't give him any advice. Just listen, ask questions, scope out what are his priorities, how's he thinking about things. I said, it's really important. Don't go in like a smart-ass World Bank, economist. You'd be really making a mistake. So the prime minister calls, they have a long conversation, and this student calls me afterwards and he said, I really tried, but I couldn't help myself. I listened for a while, then the president asked me what do I think, and I started telling him what I think, and he immediately started explaining to me how I don't know what I'm talking about. And shooting down every idea I had. So try not to make his mistake. It's real hard. You've worked really hard to be seen as a smart person. And now, more than anything, you want to be validated for that. Let your families or friends be proud next week. Soak it in, their pride in you, and then go home and don't act that way. All right. The second thing is to don't speak in fancy language. Many of you have learned new vocabularies. You've taken courses that had to develop, for analytical purposes, an expert vocabulary. It could have been economics or statistics. It could have been the leadership courses. Many of the courses developed for you an expert vocabulary so you could analyze things. Maybe you took a course in one of the social justice courses, you know, and you began to learn to use words like patriarchy or capitalism or... Don't use those words. Talk in plain language. In my courses, you know, we have vocabulary like work avoidance and disequilibrium and, you know, getting neutralized or assassinated. Don't talk that way. Unless you want to get neutralized. You know, every concept that you've learned in your courses can be translated into plain language within your own language. And learning how to translate it into your own language is a good intellectual exercise for you, because you'll come to learn what you think much better if you actually have to translate it and explain it without using any fancy language. Now, one of the big purposes of fancy language is to strut your stuff. Strut your stuff is sort of an English idiomatic expression. It means, showing off all that you know. If you are a male, it means being a peacock and spreading your fingers, your feathers. You know, well, feathers are started off that way, and showing people how beautiful you are. And of course, it has the impact of intimidating people because they don't understand what you're saying. And you think that what they're going to say to themselves is, wow, this person must be really smart because they're confusing me. And it's true, they will say that, and then they will hate you for it. Or at least they'll be intimidated by you. So that rather than building a bond of understanding and trust with them, you'll create distance. So I really advise you to translate all the words you've learned here, whatever courses you took, and translate it into your own language so that you communicate to people in ways they can understand. There's nothing in any of our languages that can't be placed into regular language. The next idea is there are different kinds of partners in the world. It's very dangerous to try to practice leadership, to try to be somebody trying to change things or improve things all on your own. It can be heroic, but it also will often be suicidal. People practicing change or leadership in complex environments need other eyes and ears. They need other people to see things they don't see. They need people to put them back together again when they feel all broken apart at the end of the day. They need people to pull them by the collar up to the balcony and say, step back and let's think about what happened in that meeting today. Don't react yet. Don't send that email. Think about things. Let's try to analyze. You need people with whom to debrief your daily or weekly experience when you're on the playing field or on the dance floor moving fast, being pushed around by other people and by the music. You need people who can help you step back and make sense of things. And many of times these people will not be allies within the organization. They'll be confidants outside the organization. There'll be people with whom there are no competing interests or competing stakes. People with whom it's completely safe to pour out whatever in your heart or whatever on your mind, and you don't have to worry that they're going to misuse the information in any way. We need confidants of that nature, people to debrief what we're going through. And I hope many of you have begun to develop relationships during this last year where you found people with whom you can talk. People who've taken some same courses. You can analyze cases together. You can talk in shorthand. You can deploy some of that vocabulary you've learned. And at the same time, they're safe. Maybe they're safe because they live 3,000 miles or 10,000 miles away. But with our extraordinary technology, which didn't exist when I started teaching, you can call somebody for free. You can get online and see their face and ask them to give you a half hour to debrief what just happened to you today. And I really urge you to hold precious some of the relationships you've begun to establish this year. It may not be necessarily your favorite person or your closest, heartfelt friend, but it may be somebody who you can trust, whose mind and heart you trust, and in a jam who you'd want to call in the middle of the day or night and say, can you give me some time and help me figure out and sort out where I am? And I'd like to suggest you compile a list of 5 to 10 people like that. Compile a list of 5 to 10 people, and even before tomorrow, send them a note saying, I wonder if you would agree to pair up over this next year and make each other available to ourselves, so that if either of us in need, we can call each other, for some help. Now, the person you call on, they may not give you the right analysis, but at least it'll be an analysis not biased by any stakes. And that's invaluable. And indeed, if you have 3 or 4 people like that, you can, triangulate and get multiple points of view to really help you figure out what are your next options as you move back into action. Treasure these new confidants. Some of you have confidants at home, members of your family, for example, or some of your closest friends. It's important to know that those people are also invaluable, but sometimes they don't have the knowledge that your colleagues have here because they haven't gone through the same, analytical courses, they haven't learned the same conceptual frameworks. Moreover, sometimes those people do have competing interests and stakes. Like maybe they come from the same ethnicity, and some of the challenges you're engaging in are challenges to your own ethnicity. Maybe if they're a family member, they come from the same family. Maybe some of the challenges you represent are challenges in your own family. And they can't be unbiased, because now they have, competing interests, competing loyalties. So not even confidants are confidants for all seasons. Some of us can be confidants on some occasions, but in other contexts, we begin to have competing loyalties, and it's not so easy to set aside those loyalties to listen in a completely caring way. I mean completely caring because you can't completely care about that person because you're also caring about other things. I think it's important as you plan to go home or plan to go to your new place, whatever that location might be, to plan the sanctuaries you're going to use. You're much more likely to withstand the stress of reentry if you have some sanctuary to return to. Now, for some of you, that will be a religious location, a place where you pray in community. For some of you, it may be a place where you meditate within a spiritual or religious tradition. For some of you, it may be your favorite bar, where you go watch yellow liquid swirling around in ice. For some of you, it may be a friend's kitchen table where you routinely have tea. You know, for some of you, it could be a park, you know, where you just go outside, and there's a particular location in that park where when you sit on that bench, somehow you begin to be restored to yourself. We need places to be restored to ourselves, because it's so easy when you re-enter to get buffeted by the force field in which you're returning, and to be pulled in all sorts of directions, to be told this is who you should be, and this is who you should be, and this is the point of view you're supposed to have, and this is the issue you're supposed to champion. And how come you're not standing up to this person? And why are you standing up to that person? And why aren't you keeping your head down? And why aren't you raising your head up? You know, and we're pulled in all of these different directions by all the voices of the people that we've internalized. And so having some location where we can quiet things down and where you can begin to hear, you know, quieter voices inside yourself is really, really priceless. Again, I'm not peddling any particular form of sanctuary. I just think we all need them. Indeed, sometimes we need more than one or two kinds of sanctuaries. And sometimes these change and evolve over the course of our lives. Some places are real sanctuaries at one point, and some places at another. You know, like here this year, some of you may have found your favorite table at your favorite cafe. Others may have found your favorite location out in that park across the way. Others may have found the perfect place to meditate or pray. And now you're going to leave. So you've got to replace it. And I'd like to suggest that you be thoughtful and deliberate and aggressive in generating that sanctuary for yourself. Because it's really easy to get so caught up in the transitional anxieties, in the transitional fears, in the transitional pressures of people around you who have expectations of you, of the expectations you've internalized. It's so easy to be completely submerged in those anxieties and pressures that it's really hard to calm down and think straight. So plan for the sanctuary, or at least plan to find one. You may not know where you're moving. You may not know what's in that location, but you can plan on day 3 that you're going to start searching, you know, for that location, that park, that bar, that house of worship, that place to meditate, whatever it is. I also think we need daily practices. For some of you, you've been developing some of those practices this year. For example, some of you in some of your courses have been asked to start journaling. For some of you, that was a new practice. And for some of you, it was an important practice, daily or weekly or every few days, to journal. Some of you may have taken up a new art form. Maybe you began to write poetry. Maybe you began to learn a musical instrument. Maybe you began to sing or to paint or to draw or to dance. We need daily, regular practices. Maybe some of you started going to the gym or started to run or started to do yoga. Again, I'm agnostic on which practice you ought to do. I'm not trying to sell you on any practice. But I really think it's important to have a sanctuary, to have confidants, and to have practices to anchor you particularly during this transitional time. And to plan for it. Okay, so let me stop there and open it up for conversation and questions. We don't have a microphone, but maybe if you talk loud enough, everybody will be able to hear, or I'll repeat your question. So just stand up or raise your hand, and I can call on you. Yes?
You talked about it's best to wait like 3 to 12 months for reentry. Like, what are some of the
No. It's best in your first 3 to 12 months to listen and do field work. Yeah.
What are the signs that you want to start being more proactive? Kind of move out of listening mode to some degree, pulling it out and switch into action.
That's a great question, really great question. Obviously, the devil is in the details, and it has to be tailored to the particular context. But the first things that come to mind, if you have a confidant or 2 or 3 confidants in here or other places that you're talking to, debriefing what you're learning in your field work, and now you're beginning to say, I think I'm ready to start taking action, let them tell you if you're really ready. That would be a safeguard. Check it out with them. And they'll test you out. Well, what's your strategy? What are your moves? Who are you going to talk to first? How are you going to frame the issue? Who are your allies in the system? Why is that the ripe issue, or is that an unripe issue? Are you going to take action to ripen it, or are you going to take an action on an issue that's already ripe that requires a different strategy? What authority do you have in the system, formal and informal? People who've studied here can ask you the questions that will help you analyze at that moment, are you ready? And then at the personal level, are you ready emotionally? Are you ready to take the heat? Are you ready to begin to become the repository of hostility? Are you emotionally ready to do that and not get defensive right away? So, people can ask you questions to help you test out. Are you ready? Is it time to start? Ultimately, it's all experimental. Because even if they tell you you're ready and you really think you're ready, you take action and you never know. So then that's why you need to debrief with people. So you could say, God, I didn't think that was going to happen. Look what happened. And then you debrief that to figure out how to take corrective action, what your next move should be. And I think once you start in action and start engaging, then your confidants, your sort of brain trust, can help you debrief safely, your moves and how to take mid-course corrective action, on an ongoing basis. Does that begin to answer your question? Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes?
So many of us are pretty idealistic and have big ideas about how we want to change the world.
Good.
But are going into bureaucracies, whether they're corporate or government. How do we maintain our sense of idealism in spaces that might try and squash those big ideas?
Yes. Well, first of all, I would go into the environment and try to listen for the idealism that is there latent or even dormant in that organization. Because many organizations do have a set of orienting values that are sometimes explicit in their mission statement or in their, prologue to their concept, self-concept. And it's important to identify, are those values there already, even if they're not operationalized? Because that gives you a safer leverage. Like you can hitch your wagon to those values. So then you're not a foreign body. You're simply reminding people of the values that we say we stand for, but we're not realizing. Now that will also be threatening and challenging, because you're telling people that they're hypocrites in one way or another. Why aren't we living up to our values? We say we care about this, but look what we're doing. So then one needs a strategy to get people to see the internal contradiction within their own value construct as an organization. And it could be one of the big consulting firms. It could be, you know, a corporation, private corporation. It could be a public organization. It could be a nonprofit. Nearly every organization drifts away from its orienting values. Because these orienting values, they're written down actually with a lot of sincerity. People are not cynical when they write these values. They're hopeful. They're aspirational. But when push comes to shove, operationalizing them often feels like it costs too much. And so people end up making trade-offs, and the survival of the organization itself begins to take priority over the realization of those initial orienting values. So first go in trying to locate, are those values there already? If they're not there, I would probably advise you go find an organization where they are there. Because you've got to be really, really skilled at and the entry points for entering that organization where you're going against the grain of even the orienting values of the organization from an entry-level position, because you're a young person. It's very dangerous, and you'd have to devote 20 years to it. So much better to find an organization where it's explicit already, you know. And then second thing you want to do in that organization is look for allies, because in any organization there's a diversity of people, some of whom are going to be more value-oriented to those orienting values, and others simply more get ahead, operation, make it work, get it, you know, in a business, make the sale. So you want to find allies and even pockets inside that organization that are a little bit more oriented to realizing the values that you care for. And particularly at the entry level, you want to find those locations so that you can feel like you're doing work that's valuable and even strengthen the hand of that pocket of people in that organization that feel similarly. You know, you become, in a sense, a set of smart troublemakers from within. Does that begin to respond to your question? I've worked for a lot of different organizations, you know, privately outside the Kennedy School, across all sectors and many countries, and I've rarely come across an organization. There have been a few that have no orienting value statement that moves me. Some don't. It's simply about shareholder value or profitability, but many do. For example, maybe 20 years ago there was a fire in my house, and the fire engines came and they were able to put out the fire, but there was a significant amount of damage. And there's a company that whenever the fire engines are called in the United States, they have a hookup to the fire alarm, and they immediately chase the fire trucks. And it's a company that cleans up messes. It's called ServiceMaster. There are several companies like that. That's one of the big national American companies that goes in after a fire or a flood and cleans up the mess. It's really ugly work. You go into a house that's been burned, and it's filled with water and soot and char and precious objects that have been damaged, and now you've got to clean it up. So this company, so I called the insurance company and I said, should I hire these folks? Because I didn't know what to do. They said, yeah, they're good folks, hire them. So we hired them. And then I did a little research on the company. And it turns out the company is based in Minneapolis, which is sort of like the heartland of America, you know, a bit more of a religious orientation than on the coasts. And their mission statement is to serve God in everything we do. Now, when I watched these mainly guys cleaning up my house and treating us with utmost respect, and this wasn't a fancy house, you know, it was not nearly as wealthy as I am now, you know, it's just a small little house. These folks were so respectful, you know, they were so thoughtful. It was as if they were really serving God in everything they were doing, even though what they were doing was really awful work. You know, just cleaning up walls and furniture and belongings, trying to sift through what was salvageable, what wasn't salvageable, trucking off the salvageable stuff to their own storage facility, you know, consulting to us on what to do. I mean, it was amazing to see the care with which they were operationalizing that orienting value. Now, I think they're a very unusual company. A lot of companies would say that, but that's not what they're doing. There are countries around the world that think that they're serving God within their religious system, but they're generating extraordinary injustice. So there will often be an internal contradiction in an organization between the explicit orienting values and the operational, the values that are actually orienting the operation. And part of our job of leadership is to help people rectify these internal contradictions that already exist within that local environment. Does that begin to respond to your question?
It does. I think the challenge that I envision is the threat of becoming one of the people that starts to make those trade-offs and decide that the status quo is good enough.
Yes, yes. I didn't speak to that, but I could see that that was there somewhere. And a lot of you will be seduced. And the values that brought you to the Kennedy School rather than to a business school will be submerged and will go dormant. And then when you turn 60, you'll wonder, what did I do? And then maybe you'll become visionary again. And the company will put you out to pasture and say, you go be a visionary on your own time. That's what I've seen with a lot of presidents of companies, you know, when they approach 60 and they start getting visionary. Okay, time for you to go to the board. Let's get another 40-something in here who's going to drive the company towards profitability. So I agree with you, you are at risk of losing your soul. And I think having confidants, a sanctuary, and even regular practices that can return you to the orienting values that are going to make you feel best when you're on your deathbed about the life that you led. And even a regular exercise, you know, once a year or every 6 months, where you project yourself into those final years of your life where you're looking back and asking, you know, did I do what I really wanted to do? And it is possible to do good and well at the same time. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. You know, one can do good by one's family, and one could do good by one's physical comforts, and at the same time do a lot of good in the world. But you've got to work at it in order to find ways to do both well and good at the same time. And I think it's really wonderful that you're aware of your own, of the temptations and your own seducibility. Now, there's a third way to work it. And I don't know if you took any of the courses that I teach, but I'm doing a 3-day workshop in June, so maybe you'll want to sign up for that if it's possible to still take it. But another place to look at is to begin to identify the expectations for making it that you carry from other people. Because your need to be a source of pride to make it is not only coming from your own life experience, it's also coming from the waters that you carry from other people. Other people who didn't make it, or were frustrated, or were humiliated, or were poor. And each of us, as we grow up, begin to inherit some of the unresolved dilemmas of life from other people, from our families, from our previous generations, from our friends, from our ethnicity, from our gender. And we begin to then carry those waters as if we're supposed to fix that problem for those people. If you could fix that problem for those people, that'd be great. Like if you could actually undo the frustrations of their lives by making it, that would be great. I mean, you could really make it and buy, your parents a nice house, that'd be great. But it's not going to solve your mother's frustration that she never got to have the career she wanted, if that's one of her frustrations. Or it's never going to solve your father's frustration that a war came and he was never able to finally go to school, or that this happened or that happened. You might be able to diminish the pain by putting them up in a new house, a nice place, but they still got to figure out how to make their life feel good. You see? So you can't really frequently resolve the problems that you've inherited of other people. And you certainly can't if they're dead. You can honor them, but you can't solve their problem. You can't, so one of the ways you can manage the temptations you're carrying, the seducibility, is to realize you're not only carrying your own waters of the hunger to make it, to be successful in some kind of term, you're also carrying the hunger of other people, like you're making it on their behalf. And when you begin to identify all those people's waters you're carrying, you can begin to decide to lay down those waters. You can say to your family member, I really wish that I could solve your problem for you, but I can't. It is your problem. I can be with you. In my religious tradition, in the Jewish tradition, there's a phrase where God says to one of the early patriarchs, Jacob. God says to Jacob, I cannot save you from the fire and the water, but I can be with you in the fire and the water. So you can say to the people around you who haven't made it, now you're supposed to make it for them. I can be with you as you continue to tell me about your frustrations in life. I can help you problem solve it. But there's nothing I'm going to do in my career that's going to take that all away. And I'm not going to select the path of my own, life's work based on trying to meet your need when in the end it isn't going to do it for you anyway. So that's another place you might go to understand that your seducibility is heightened because of your desire to make people you care about happy. One of the hard things in life is discovering your finite ability to reverse history. Does that speak to you at all? You're welcome. Hi.
I have an adjacent question.
Yes.
Some of my classmates and I, we talked about this kind of risk paradox. We come here, we get this fancy degree, we meet all these great people, we could do something really, kind of roll the dice, but we end up working for McKinsey or the World Bank.
Right.
And so I'm not sure I want to wait until I'm 60 to be a visionary. And I'm curious, in your years watching alumni through the arcs of their careers, how do you see that playing out?
Yeah.
Unless it is, the answer is we just have to wait until we're 60.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I think McKinsey and the World Bank, I've worked for both of those. In fact, I was in Australia last week for 2 days for McKinsey, consulting for them, to them. There are pockets of highly aspirational people in both those places. People in the World Bank really do want to alleviate poverty. Unfortunately, they're wedded to their particular expertise and know-how, so that they keep trying and not quite knowing how to do it. In the terms that I use, they keep treating these cultural, behavioral, political, adaptive challenges as if they were technical problems amenable to expert analysis and expert solutions. So, like McKinsey makes the same mistake, you know, they'll apply all of their analytical skill to scoping out a client and then giving 250 slides that are filled with brilliant ideas, most of which never get implemented, because they treat the adaptive challenge as if it were a technical problem. It's the most common failure in leadership, is that diagnostic failure. So, but nevertheless, their hearts are in the right place. They really would. The problem is that for a lot of these organizations, there are other parts of their model of operation that generates this contradiction or this lack of efficiency in realizing the value that they'd like to generate for the client or for the country. So I'm speaking about the World Bank and McKinsey. So I think it's possible to practice leadership within the World Bank and to help the World Bank do good works. And I think it's also possible within McKinsey to do good works. There are people in McKinsey who are trying to do good works and thinking more expansively beyond the standard model of 10 weeks, you know, fast, in and out, analytical, and move on. There are other people in McKinsey trying to do it differently. Now, you know, over the course of my career, I've seen those pockets of people in the World Bank and in McKinsey get killed off and then come back online, you know, because it's going to take a while, maybe a career, to build a sustainable and robust area of practice within either of those institutions that creates more value. That really creates more value. But again, I would not two-dimensionalize any organization, certainly those two, in regard to the possibility that from that location you can generate value.
And I hold them up more as examples of like the path well trodden, where we might be, we kind of see these degrees as this inflection point in our lives that we have to prove or justify
Yes.
it by working at a McKinsey or a World Bank instead of taking the path less traveled. And how do we kind of overcome that
Yes.
inertia?
Yes. Well, I think the advice I'd like to give you, and not just you, but for many of you who are seeking new jobs, is to use your technical language that you learned here, to relax the constraint of being a perfectionist. That is, don't try to find the perfect job. You know, you spend a year, those of you in transition, trying to figure out what's next. Don't try to find just the right location. Be experimental. Whatever job you take, job you take, you're going to learn from that place. That'll inform the next job 6 months or 2 years from now. So better to learn by doing. Jump into something that is a maybe, that you're going to check out, and then learn from there what's next. And if you see it as an ongoing improvisation, you know, the constructing of career path, kind of like, you know, you buy software and it's version, you know, 3.0 and then it's version 3.1. If you see your career that way, then you have the flexibility to learn from wherever you are and then move if you need to move. Some people I know who graduate get stuck in trying, and they keep looking for just the right thing, and 6 months or a year later, they still haven't found a job. I would suggest learn by doing rather than learn by, staring at your, navel. Other thoughts? Yes?
What would you say to those who are going to the same job? So people are expecting you to do something different.
Yes.
To be different.
Yes.
And you need to react
Yes.
quietly, but you cannot because they're asking you.
Oh, yes. Here's how to be different. Let them say, wow, she's so much more curious than she's ever been. She's not nearly as much of a smartass as she used to be. She doesn't seem to need to be the smartest person in the room again. She doesn't seem to always be trying to prove that women can do X, Y, and Z. She's actually interested. I mean, I don't know anything about you because we didn't work together. But, those are some of the things, let them be surprised at how curious and interested you are. How much more interested you are in understanding the terrain than you used to be. That you're slower in making pronouncements or interpretations or having answers. That would be a big shock, at least for some of you, of the people back home. Now, I don't know, does any of that apply to you or not really?
I think, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
One of the best things humans do is forget.
I'm sorry?
Forget.
Yes.
One of the things humans do the best. Let's go to 13 months after today. We're all busy doing the things. We've had failures and ups and downs.
Yes.
What's from your experience the advice you'd like to offer us to remember? Now we're all propped up. We have graduation. We have all the.
Yes. Right. You have your notebooks all lined up or your files organized on your drive. Yes. Great question. Again, I think forming little pods of 2 or 3 people with your colleagues so that you're in regular conversation and can be reminded of what you've learned, and where you share cases or dilemmas from your life and get each other's help, and where you are reminded through the application, of the ideas you've learned on a regular basis. Now, the best way is, again, this list of people that I've asked you to generate from your colleagues here, from some of your courses. But there are some other ways, formal ways. For example, there are 3 different alumni networks that I know of that are really worth checking out. One is the regular Kennedy School Alumni Network. In some cities, they have regular gatherings. And you can meet with alumni from previous years, and by getting together with them, you'll be reminded of what you learned. Another is Marshall Gans has an alumni network called the Leading Change Network. You can Google that. And for those people who are doing organizing, that's another really wonderful network. And people share lessons and ideas and experiments, and they can keep reminding themselves when they're in the trenches in isolation far away. And a third network is a network that my colleagues and I started around the same time Marshall did, called the Adaptive Leadership Network. And so you could check that out also on the web. And we have hundreds of alumni from around the world, and we have regular conversations and casework and mini courses, and then a directory where you can find people in your location with whom to continue to refresh what you've learned. But if you expect to be able to do it on your own, you will fail, probably. That would be my 90% probability. It's really, really hard to not regress to your previous posture when you return to the social force field. Because everybody's going to say to you, what is your name? Timur. Everybody's going to say, Timur, be our Timur. What happened to my Timur? You're my, what happened to my son? What happened to my cousin? What happened to my nephew? What happened to my expert? What happened to my colleague? What happened to my friend? Like a rubber band, everybody's going to be pulling you back and say, be back, don't change, don't, because if you change, then you're going to put pressure on me. You know? And so there's going to be a lot of regressive pressures like rubber bands attached to you to ask you to return to your previous understanding. Now, many of you are acquainted with that pressure already. Like, how many of you went away to university when you were 18 or 20 years old, and then after a few years away, you came back home, or 6 months away, or 1 year away, you came back home to your family, and your family looked at you and said, "What happened to my darling? What happened to my sweetheart? You know, where did you get these ideas?" How many of you had that happen to you? Raise your hand. So, you know, many of you know what it means to renegotiate these loyalties, where, you know, you have to reassure people, I'm still your, you know, I'm still your little Timor, you know? I'm still your Timor the Great, even though I'm still not so great yet. But I'm still planning to meet your expectations and be the next Timor the Great. Okay? So you can reassure people, as you probably did when you started having these new ideas in your head, when you started leaving home and collecting new ideas. So many of you have experience doing that already. And part of what enabled you to sustain the change in yourself were friends and confidants, or new lovers and, you know, family members, you know, that you chose, and so forth, colleagues. So I'm giving you back the same principle that you probably used earlier in your life. At this point, though, you have to plan for it. You have to plan to expect to regress to your previous form, that the pressures are going to be overwhelming, and you're just a human being, and you can't tell them, listen, I know you named me for Timor the Great, but actually I've changed my name to Max the Pathetic. And I still hope you'll love me, because I've decided I really don't want to be great. I just want to be regular and even pathetic. So can I tell you my most recent pathetic story? I'm using, obviously, an exaggeration, but I wouldn't expect you to go that far away from Timor the Great. That's a lot to carry. Talk about waters. Your names sometimes embody the waters that you're carrying. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts? Yes? What's one book?
Yeah, not your own story.
Yeah, well, I would say you know, I would say go back to some of the sacred texts in your own tradition and read them for yourself with fresh eyes, accepting the contradictions in those texts, imagining an interpretation that's different than the one that you were told, and rediscovering some of the wisdom in those texts. So, you know, where is your ancestry from?
China.
So I would go back to the Tao Te Ching, you know, or one of your other ancient texts. You know, go back to, you know, Mencius or Confucius, or, you know, others. But read them with fresh eyes, you know, not through the ways in which they were interpreted for you as a student. Okay, and then so that would be one category, and then let's see, and then I guess I'd listen to Bob Dylan. If I'm going to be imperialistic and push out you my particular. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes. Hi. I can't see you through the lights, but
Sorry, for a question from the balcony.
please.
As we prepare for the losses that we are going to face after graduating from
Yeah.
school,
Yeah.
there's a lot of loss we are going to experience in the next 9 days. The loss of being in this kind of a space,
Yes.
being with these kinds of people,
Yes.
of our companionships here. How do we navigate these losses?
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert on it because, as Carol said, I stuck around. I was in your shoes in 1983 graduating, and I immediately joined the faculty. So, but I would say, I would repeat what I said before. Join one of these networks. The Kennedy School Alumni Network, Marshall Ganz's Leading Change Network, or our Adaptive Leadership Network. And get yourself confidants and partners, you know, in a sense to reduce the loss, because you end up holding on to some of the value, even though you won't physically be here. Some of these people will be in your own locale. Some of them, through these networks, you'll discover are in your city, wherever you live, from a previous generation of students, maybe from 5 or 10 years ago, or 20. And then you can reach out to them and say, hey, I'd love to talk. What do you remember? What have you learned? Tell, you know, and you can begin to form local networks of people who can reinforce learnings and support each other and reminisce, you know, also about the joy. And keep in touch with each other. And then come back to the alumni reunions every 5 years. You know, I think it's really important to try to keep alive what was most of value to you here. But I think it takes deliberate work. You can't, it won't happen automatically. You know, what'll happen automatically is that you'll just be once again embraced and enveloped by the social system you're returning to. And that might be wonderful, but it could be, you could have both. You could have that wonderfulness, but still keep a part of yourself alive so that then when you, in that wonderfulness, you can be a more effective source of leadership and change. So try to keep yourself tethered to other people and other structures from this place. Yeah. Yes?
For those of us who are moving to a new place, how do you create a new sense of place or home while still holding on to old loyalties?
Well, I think some of what I've said, you know, I've response to that. So just to summarize again, some of the confidants that you've generated here can stay with you in this new place using Zoom and FaceTime and other forms of communication. You can stay in touch with people. Second, you can find a sanctuary there. And third, some of the practices you've begun to develop here or from your earlier history, you know, sustaining practices, you can continue in that foreign place, that new place. So I think all of those anchors can continue to sustain you as you begin to discover and develop new relationships, new professional collaborations, new friends, and new places that will serve as, you know, sanctuaries for you. But I think it's important to have a transitional strategy that helps sustain you in the loneliness in that new place. Again, by holding on to some of the relationships and staying in touch with some of your friends here. Some of them will be going through the same thing. They'll also be in a new place. So then you can talk about each other's experience, you know, and that itself will be helpful. And then I hope that one of the virtues that has been rekindled in this year here is the virtue that you had as a child. We all had as a child, which is endless curiosity. Kind of an adventuresome curiosity. So in this new place, be curious. Just check everything out. You know, new neighborhoods, restaurants, cafes, places of worship, gyms, art forms, you know, just be curious. Even if it's way foreign to anything you've ever explored. Because the great thing about little children is they haven't been taught yet what to stop being curious about. They're just curious about everything. And then they're taught over time, by the time they get to be your age, they've been taught, don't be curious about that. Don't be curious about those folks. Those folks are dangerous. Don't be curious about these people. Don't be curious about that. Stop asking too many questions. So for many of us, by the time we're an adult, the curiosity in us has been shamed out. So try to get back in touch with that curiosity in this new place, where you can just be adventuresome and discover and learn and then send some of us a note and let us know how did it go. All right, I'm going to have to stop in a couple of minutes, so I need to bless you. So, one of the great tragic moments in Jewish history was about 2,000 years ago, just about 37 years after Jesus was killed. A crazy group of zealots stupidly decided to pick a fight with the Roman Empire and started to launch a war of independence to free the Jewish homeland from the Roman conquest. And so they picked this fight in 68 AD, and within 2 years, the Romans had suppressed the rebellion and destroyed Jerusalem. And so there were two basic responses to this destruction and enslavement and exile. One was to keep fighting. So a small group of people continued to fight. They finally retreated to a mountaintop in the desert, and where they had generated supplies. And they held out for about 2 years. And the Romans, who were great engineers, they finally built a ramp up to the top of that mountain. And on the eve of conquering those 800 people living on that mountaintop, all 800, and I think it was 850 something, they all decided to commit suicide rather than be captured by the Romans and either killed, raped, or enslaved. And so that has gone down in history because there was a Roman historian who told this story. His name was Josephus, and he wrote down this history of this mountaintop called Masada. Now, on the one hand, people consider that a heroic response to this devastating war. But I think of it as just stupid, heroic suicide. And indeed, the war itself was kind of dumb, because you shouldn't pick a fight unless you've really thought through, do you have it in you to win that fight, particularly if it's a war of independence. Now, having destroyed the homeland, another response, rather than fight, was quite radically different. There was a rabbi named Yohanan, the son of Zakkai, who persuaded the Roman general who was in charge to let him start a school. he said, you know, you've taken over Jerusalem, you've destroyed our homeland, but let me start a school. And the Romans valued education because they modeled themselves after the Greeks. And they said, okay, we'll let you start a school. So he started a school just south of what's now Tel Aviv in a little village called Yavne. Now that school has continued to operate now for 2,000 years. And one of the first things he did was to bring together the elders of his day, the other rabbis, and he asked them this extremely painful question. What are we going to conserve from our tradition? What are we going to discard? And what innovations will we need to help our people maintain faith in exile and slavery? So then they began to discuss what to keep, what to discard, and how to innovate. And they argued and debated for 100 years. One of the innovations was to create what many of us know as the Bible. Before then, there had been no Bible. There were many sacred texts, but they had never been brought all together into one canon. But they figured, you know, we need to give people a portable book to run around with in exile. So they put together this Bible, but then that was a hard debate, because, you know, which books do you leave in and which books do you leave out? Nobody thinks about the Bible as the outcome of a political bargain, but that's what it was. Another innovation is that they turned the physical structure of the sanctuary, you know, the great temple in Jerusalem, into a physical structure. It became the family. It became, a social structure. The physical structure became a social structure. The family became the sanctuary, because at least that would be portable. Now then, who was going to be the priest? Because the priests became obsolete, because all the priestly functions were centered around the great temple. And now the priesthood was going to become obsolete, so who was going to stand in for the priest and pray over the community at the beginning of the Sabbath on Friday evening? Well, it will be the father. Now the mother as well. But back then it was just the father. The father will be the priest. So all of a sudden, as a product of this tragedy, you had extraordinary innovation that made the tradition a great deal better than it was previously. And one of the innovations was to authorize fathers and now mothers to recite the priestly blessing over the community, over their family. Indeed, every Friday night, I would have the opportunity to pray over my children. May God bless you and keep you. May God shine her face unto you and be gracious unto you. May she smile on everything that you do, protect you from harm, give you a virtuous and good life, and keep you safe.